All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei Haba Alina Latova, Yoel and Sarah Kelman in celebration of the completion of Seder Nezikin and Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Nathan Perry Smith in the schos of the entire Kehillah, and our Tfilos being the Skabel on high. Our week of learning sponsors, Jonathan and Alana Austin, in honor of the engagement of their daughter Tamar, to Yair Ashendorf of Teaneck, New Jersey. May they be Zochem Meretz Hashem to build a Bayis Ne'eman B'Yisrael. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Mark Kogan, in honor of the entire Shir. Beautiful. All right, well, so with that, let us begin. Today's Daf is Yud Beis. We have a really exciting Daf ahead of us today. Baruch Hashem, we're beginning at the Mishnah on Yud Aleph Amud Beis 11b. Mishnah says as follows: HaPesach sheshachtu shachris ba'arbasar shalol lishmo. Very interesting case. Let's say you went ahead and you checked out a Karban Pesach on the 14th, which of course is Erev Pesach, shalol lishmo. Shalol lishmo means not for the sake of Karban Pesach. If it's not for the sake of Karban Pesach, then what is it for? Then ultimately, again, let's say for the sake of Shlomim. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Rabbi Yeshua machshir kilinishchat b'shlosh asar. Rabbi Yeshua says shechting it on the morning of the 14th is no different than shechting it on the 13th. Right? It just was, I don't know, wasn't going on. So it's no different than shechting on the 13th. And therefore, halacha l'mais. Remember again, a Pesach shalol lishmo, right, during the rest of the year, ultimately is considered to be a Karban Shlomim. Therefore, Rabbi Yeshua says ultimately that it is going to be kosher. Then the Seira posel kilinishchat bein arbaim. The Seira says no, it's posel as if it was shechted shalol lishmo on the afternoon of the 14th, which of course would render it invalid. Amr Shimon ben Azai. Shimon ben Azai said as follows: the kubal ani mipi shivim ushnayim zakim. I have a Kabbalah from 72 elders. That's of course the Sanhedrin. So the Gemara says, B'yom Shor Shivo asked Rabbi Eliezer b'yeshiva, the day that they went ahead and they appointed Rabbi Eliezer as the head of the yeshiva. Shekol Zevachim anachalon shenizbechu shalol lishman ksherim. That in general, and we'll say this really is just a repeat of what we saw in the first Mishnah in the Masechta. That in general, any karbanos ultimately again that were offered up shalol lishman are still kosher. Except that they do not satisfy the obligation of their owner. So we'll say, remember again, that is a repeat of the first halacha that we saw in the Masechta, with the exception of chutz, mina pesach or mina chatas, with the exception of pesach and chatas. We saw this before. Pesach and chatas are the exceptions to this rule, because karban pesach and karban chatas, if you shech them shalol lishmo, not only do they not count towards the owner's obligation, but ultimately again, they also do not go ahead and they are not valid karbanos. For the Hosef ben Azai ela ha'ola, Ben Azai also wanted to add an ola to this category. He wanted to say that if you shecht an ola shalol lishmo, it also doesn't count towards the owner, and in addition is also possible. For the Hodlo Chachamim, but the Chachamim ultimately again did not agree to this ruling. Okay, so we'll say it's really fascinating. So the Ikar Halach over here is when it comes to Karban Pesach. What happens if you go ahead? Now remember, Karban Pesach is shechted when? The 14th. But when on the 14th? Afternoon. What happens if you shecht a Karban Pesach on the morning of the 14th? Thank you. Shalol lishmo. Ultimately, again, shalol lishmo, meaning not for the sake of Pesach. What does it mean not for the sake of Pesach? For the sake of Shlomim. For the sake of something else. What is the status of that carbon? So Rabbi Yeshua says it's mutter, because again, essentially shechting it on the morning of the 14th is no different than shechting on the 13th. And any time you shecht a Karban Pesach not at its designated time, by definition, it's reclassified as a Karban Shlomim. Rabbi Beseira says no, it is possible as if you shechted it shalol lishmo on the afternoon of the 14th. That's the Ikar Machlokes we're going to be dealing with for now. So let's analyze. It says in Amr Rabbi Lazar, Amr Rabbi Oshia, Machshir hayib ben Beseira bepesach sheshachtu shachris ba'arbasar lishmo dekula yoma zmanehu. Ooh, so this is very interesting. So Lazar says at the core of this is a fascinating idea. Ben Beseira says that halacha l'maisa, if you ended up shechting the Karban Pesach on the morning of the 14th, the carbon is kosher, which Rabbi says is very dramatic. It's very dramatic. Why? Because Ben Beseira holds that Me'ikar Adin, really according to the letter of the law, the entire day of Erev Pesach is fit for Karban Pesach Shchita. The Gemara says, Umay ki'ilu. So what does Ben Beseira mean when he says that if you shechted on the morning of the 14th, it's as if you shechted it in the afternoon? The Dam Rabbi Yeshua ki'ilu, Amar nami ki'ilu, Amar ihu nami ki'ilu. So the truth is, Ben Beseira just said that as textual symmetry, that since Rabbi Yeshua said ki'ilu, therefore Ben Beseira also said ki'ilu. But I will say, but this is very interesting, right? This is actually quite dramatic. The truth is, it's too dramatic for this early in the morning, right? But again, just understand what just happened over here. My whole life, we've been focusing on this idea that Karban Pesach, its time is Bein Arbaim, the afternoon of the 14th. Now, suddenly, there is an opinion that says you could even shecht Karban Pesach on the morning of the 14th. So again, we'll analyze where that comes from. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, if that's the case, then why does the Mishnah frame the Machlokes Rabbi Shmuel ben Beseira as a Karban Pesach shechted shelo l'shmo? Why frame it that way? Liflagu b'shmo. Make it even better. Make it a Machlokes about a Karban Pesach shechted on the morning of the 14th l'shem Karban Pesach, because that's a much more dramatic case, right? Because then Ben Beseira is going to say that it's kosher. And Rabbi Yeshua ultimately again is going to say that it's possible. To which the Gemara says, because if they would have argued in a case of the Shmo where the Karban Pesach was shechted, Lishmo on the morning of the 14th, Havamina, Aval B'Shalo Lishmo, Modi Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira, Holu Miktsasa Roi. Because I would have thought otherwise, Rabbi Yeshua would have agreed with Ben Beseira. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yeshua would have agreed with Ben Beseira. Ultimately, and again, in the case of Shalol Lishmo, since Halacha L'Maisa, part of the day is fit for the offering of that carbon, Kamash Malan that they disagree in a case of Shalol Lishmo. Okay, so both say, so now the Gemara circles back. So remember again, the earth-shattering piece that's been introduced over here is that Halacha L'Maisa, Ben Beseira says that a Karban Pesach is kosher Lishmo on the morning of the 14th. So now the Gemara is just questioning that. How could that possibly be? The Gemara says, V'haksiv bein ha'arbayim. But the pasuk explicitly says that Karban Pesach is offered up bein ha'arbayim. What does bein ha'arbayim mean? Bein ha'arbayim, at least as far as we knew, always meant what? The afternoon. So how can you say that it's kosher on the morning of the 14th? Amar Ula is very interesting. Amar Ula breid Ravi Loi, bein shnei aravim. This is fascinating. What does bein ha'arbayim mean? Bein Harbayim doesn't mean the afternoon. Rather, Bein Harbayim means between the two evenings. Fascinating. So when can you offer up Karban Pesach? Between nightfall and nightfall. Essentially between nightfall on the beginning of the 14th. Now obviously, you can't offer up a carbon at night. Right? Karbanos are not offered up at night. But what it means is the time frame is essentially between the evenings, between what we'll call the night of the 14th. Remember, the 14th begins at night, and then the following evening, which is the eve of the 15th. In other words, or stated otherwise, you have the entire day to offer up Karban Pesach. So we'll say that is quite dramatic. So the Gemara says, good, Mishnah Rav. So one second. So does that mean that every single time the Torah uses the word Bein Ha'arbayim, that Bein Ha'arbayim doesn't mean afternoon? Bein Ha'arbayim means between the evenings? Are you actually putting that forward? Because again, it's going to introduce a lot of very interesting ideas. The Gemara says, Tamid, Tichsiv ba Bein Ha'arbayim, Hachinam Dikol Yom HaKasher. So about Karban Tamid. Right, the daily sacrifice. It also says, remember, again, both said it's a Tamid Shal Shachar, a morning Tamid, and a Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim, which is communal daily offering. And up until now, we thought that meant for the afternoon. Now you're telling me it means the entire day, to which the Gemara says, no, it's different, because there it explicitly says, one keves, one sheep you shall offer up in the morning. I could infer from that, therefore, that the other sheep that's offered up bein ha'arbayim literally means the afternoon. V'idach kuli yoma. So say that one carbon is offered up in the morning, and the other carbon, the bein ha'arbayim one, could be offered up the entire day. So the Gemara says, no, echad baboker v'lo shnayim baboker. No, because the Torah says echad baboker. Only one of them could be offered up in the morning, not two. Fine. So therefore, I will say Tamid is going to be different, even though it says bein ha'arbayim. Bein ha'arbayim by Tamid can't mean the whole day. Next, Neiros, Tichseh bein ha'arbayim, Hachanam Dikul Yom HaKasher. So what about the menorah? By the menorah, it also says you should kindle the menorah bein ha'arbayim. Are you coming to say then that bein ha'arbayim means you can kindle the menorah all day? To which the Gemara says, no, shiny hasam, it's different there. Why? Dichsiv me'erev ad boker. The pasuk says ultimately again from the evening up until the morning, namely again that the candles must remain lit. Me'erev ad boker. So the Gemara says, me'erev ad boker. Davar acher, ein lecha avod l'kshira me'erev ad boker elazu bilvad. Furthermore, the Gemara says another interesting point over here about the menorah. If you take a look at the last Rashi, ein lecha avoda me'avodo shein amuros biyom kigon avodas adam v'kamso ktar sheksher me'halakas neros ve'ilach. Because remember again, essentially what the Gemara is introducing is that once you kindle the menorah, many other sacrificial rites and rituals can no longer be done. So by definition, it makes sense that the menorah was done as late in the day as possible so as to allow these other sacrificial rites and rituals to be done. What about Ketorah? So all the Gemara is doing over here is Ben Beseira is being machadesh that the phrase Bein Ha'arbayim actually means between the evenings. Now he's using that to teach us that Karban Pesach could actually be offered the entire day of the 14th. The problem just is we find that phrase Bein Ha'arbayim by many different karbanos or many different aspects of the Beis HaMikdash. And how do we reconcile that? What about Ketoras? Incense, Tichsiv, Ba Bein Ha'arbayim. So we'll say, now remember again, Ketoras is offered up twice, right? Ketoras is offered up in the morning, Ketoras is offered up Bein Ha'arbayim. So you're going to say that Bein Ha'arbayim also means that halacha l'maisa, again, you could do it the whole day. So the Gemara Hakanami the chuli yoma kasher shiny Ketoras is different type of Yud Beis 12a the iskish leneros. So Ketoras is different. Why? Because ultimately, again, Ketoras is compared to the menorah, and just as we've established that menorah is done later in the day, so to Ketoras Bein Ha'arbayim means the afternoon, not all day. Fine. So Rabbi says, so now, interestingly enough, right? Right? So now, Rabbi says, interestingly enough, what we now see is that Ben Beseira is understanding Karban Pesach could be offered up the entire day on Erev Pesach. Why? Because he's understanding the phrase Bein Ha'arbayim means Bein Ha'aravim, between the evenings. So you have the entire day, and that doesn't share because all other situations where it says Bein Ha'arbayim, we could explain it. Explain it to me differently. 1 second. Here's still a problem. So we'll say 12a, first line. Hasam namik siv sham tizbach esa pesach ba'erev. So we'll say here's the problem. By Karban Pesach, the Torah explicitly says, when should you offer up the Karban Pesach? Ba'erev, in the evening. Now, evening doesn't have to literally mean evening, but one thing is clear, which is evening doesn't mean what? Right? It doesn't mean morning. So doesn't that seem to point to the idea that Karban Pesach is in fact offered up in the afternoon? To which the Gemara is very interesting, hahu li'achar. So ultimately, li'uchar, that is ultimately again coming to teach me that Karban Pesach is offered later. Now, what does that mean? This is very interesting. So remember, if you think about this, on the afternoon of Erev Pesach, there are two karbanos that are going to come up. What are the two karbanos? Karban Pesach and the Karban Tamid, the afternoon Tamid. Now, generally, the halacha is like this. If you wait to offer up the Karban Pesach until the time of the Tamid comes along, then what's the halacha? You have to offer up the Tamid first and the Karban Pesach second. What's the logic behind that? Tadir v'she'ino tadir, tadir kodem. Ultimately, again, when you have two mitzvahs and one occurs with greater frequency, we perform the more frequent mitzvah first. If you look at Rashi says over a second line from the top in Rashi, Yu'uchar davar, Yu'uchar Pesach l'tamid, da'afagav the kuli yomas maneh, even though technically speaking, you could offer the Karban Pesach the entire day, Ishia adzman shchitas atamid, Tamid Kodem Lo. So again, I will say this is very interesting. So what the Gemara says, according to Ben Beseira, the Sham Tizbach Esa Pesach Ba'erev is teaching you that as much as, according to Ben Beseira, you have the entire day to offer the Karban Pesach, but halacha l'maisa, if you waited until the afternoon, and therefore it's the time for the Tamid, you have to offer the Tamid before the Pesach. The Gemara said, Disanya, Yu'uchar davar shenemar bo ba'erev u'bein ha'arbayim l'davar shalom ne'emar bo ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad. Because interestingly enough, by Karban Pesach, you have two expressions. Ba'erev in the evening and bein ha'arbayim. By Tamid, all you have is bein ha'arbayim. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, delay the Karban that has ba'erev and bein ha'arbayim and put that after the one that just says bein ha'arbayim. So again, this is all in Ben Beseira's model. Although Karban Pesach is kosher the entire day, if you waited and now it's the time for the Tamid, you're going to go ahead and offer up the Tamid first and Pesach second. The Gemara says, 1 second. Does that make any sense? Let me get this straight. But Karban Pesach, according to Ben Beseira, you can even shecht it in the morning, right? The entire day is kosher. So now I have a carbon that could be offered up even in the morning. But yet if I wait to offer up that carbon until the afternoon, now I have to do something before it. It just seems a little counterintuitive. So the Gemara says, no, that is in fact correct. Dam Rabbi Yochanan, so we'll say, because after all, it's actually a very important halacha. Halacha, mispalel shel mincha v'achar kach mispalel shel musafin. So we'll say, let's say for argument's sake, halacha l'maisa again, davening is going long. This, by the way, is an issue that comes up on Yomim Noram. It's actually a very interesting idea. Let's say again, it's after Chat. Now, mincha could be davened at 6.5 hours into the day. So on a general day, let's say again Rosh Chodesh or something. So let's say I'm going to daven Musaf. I'm going to daven Musaf early, and mincha is not going to be till later. But let's say again davening is going much longer. So now, interestingly enough, it's mincha gidol. It's 6.5 hours into the day, and now I have not yet davened Musaf. So now I have 2 tefillos in front of me, Musaf and mincha. Which one should come first? So the Gemara says the halach is mispalel shel mincha v'achar kach mispalel shel Musaf. We daven mincha first and then musaf. Again, why? Tadir v'she'eno tadir kodem. Again, because mincha occurs with greater frequency. So the point of the Gemara is over here is you see this model. Now remember, when can you daven musaf? When do you have to daven musaf? The whole day. So you see from here that even though you have something that can be done the whole day, once you get to a certain time frame, and that time frame allows for performance of a different mitzvah, which occurs with greater frequency, you perform the more frequent mitzvah first. So the Gemara says, "Ubein arbayim." So good. So ubein arbayim d'chsev gabe kitoris v'neros lamali. So the Gemara says, let me just ask you, the ubein arbayim by kitoris and neros. Why do I need that? V'o teishiv Rebbe tachas ben Beseira div Rabbi Yoshua. Furthermore, again, Rebbe answered on behalf of ben Beseira. According to the words of Rabbi Yoshua, lo im amrit b'shlosha asar she'ein miksaso roi. So again, remember, he answered back, if you're going to say on the 13th, in other words, if Karban Pesach was offered up on the 13th, where no part of the 13th is fit for Karban Pesach, say that on the 14th, part of the day is fit for Karban Pesach. But Ben Beseira, if you are correct, kulo roihu, then it's not just part of the 14th that is fit for Karban Pesach, but rather what? The entire 14th that is fit for Karban Pesach. Ella, Rabbi Yochanan, Posel haya ben Beseira bepesach sheshachto ba'arba asar shachris bein l'shmo bein shalo l'shmo hoel umikzaso roi. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan reinvents ben Beseira a little bit, and he holds like this: that ben Beseira holds that if one shechted the Karban Pesach in the morning, whether you did it l'shmo or shalo l'shmo, ultimately again it is going to be pasul. The carbon is going to be pasul. Why? Because part of the day is fit for the carbon. Ultimately, again, in other words, that the afternoon is fit for the carbon, the morning is not. Very interesting. So the Gemara says as follows. The Megadet bought Rabbi Avo. So Rabbi Avo said, 1 second. Rabbi Avo said, Megadet Rabbi Avo means Rabbi Avo was like a little bit surprised. If this is the case, Imkain, Pesach Kashla ben Beseira, Hechi Mishkachasla. So we'll say this is fascinating. How do you ever find a Karban Pesach that is kosher according to Ben Beseira? Now why would be the issue? Ida afreshea idna dichui meikarahu. So we'll say here's the interesting part. If halacha l'maisa, a person designates the carbon on the morning of the 14th, the problem is now we're reinventing it, that according to Ben Beseira, he agrees you can't offer it up in the morning. If that's the case, if you designate it in the morning, that is an inappropriate designation because the carbon can't be shechted then. If it can't be shechted then ultimately again it's set aside for non-use. And I will say, we've seen this concept before, that once a carbon is effectively set aside for non-use or for non-sacrifice, for non-offering, ultimately it becomes sets aside and precluded for use forever. So the Gemara said the idat v'shinu me'esmol, and ultimately again, if you designated it on the 13th, if that's the case, nira v'nitchu, then it was fit, but then effectively becomes unfit on the morning of the 14th. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Dichui me'karahu, Rashi says, the b'shas hafrasha lo chazi lemidi. because according to Ben Beseira, if you're separating or designating it out in the morning of the 14th, it's not fit for sacrificial use in the morning of the 14th. So ultimately, again, according to Ben Beseira, how are you ever having an effective Karban Pesach? No, we could keep a simple case that maybe the designation of the Karban Pesach, in fact, occurs after midday. Because after midday, it's a proper designation. Why? Because Lamaise can be offered up as a Karban then as well. Abai says, Afilu mitema mitzafra. No, you could even do it in the morning. Why? Because once you get to the calendrical date of the 14th, you're good to go. Even though you can't offer up the Karban Pesach until that afternoon, it's not considered to be what we call mechusar zman, lacking time. Interestingly enough, you could even designate it at night. In other words, the night of the 14th. Why? Laila ein mechusar zman. Ultimately, because nighttime is not considered to be a lacking in the calendrical designation. Because even though you can't offer it up at night, but Lamaisa, it's being designated on the correct day. The Tani Rabbi Shmuel, Lel Shmini Nichnas Ladir Lehes Aser, Ukidrabi Afturiki. This is very interesting about this. So remember, the halacha is as follows. You cannot offer up an animal as a Karban for the first 7 days after it's born. Right? Shivas Yom Tiatachas Imo. For 7 days, the animal, the baby, is with its mother. Now, not only can you not offer it up as a Karban, but you also can't designate it as Meiser Behema. But what can you do? Let's say the animal is born 7 days later, the night of the 8th, which is the night after the 7th day, you could already go ahead and go into the pen and designate that animal as Meiser Behema. The Rabbi Afturiki, Ramik Siv. He contrasts the psukim. What do the psukim say? The animal will live for 7 days under its mother. So what do you see from here? That already the night of the 8th, it is fit to be designated carbonically. But the pasuk says only from the 8th day and on can it be counted as a karban. So the Gemara says ha laila lo chazi. You see from here that on the night of the 8th it can't be designated. How do you reconcile this? Ha ketzad laila likdusha v'yom lahartza. Ultimately, at night you could designate it, but the offering itself could only be done by day. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara is suggesting the same thing with Karban Pesach. You could have a Karban Pesach that is designated the night of the 14th, even though what? It can't be offered up until the day of the 14th. Lema kasav Rabbi Yochanan. I will say, the Gemara kind of detours here a little bit and does something quite interesting. It must say that Rabbi Yochanan holds the following, Balei Chaim Nidchin. So we'll say, we've seen this before, Balei Chaim Nidchin means that once an animal is precluded from being offered, it is forever set aside for non-use. Dichoy literally means pushed aside. Once it's pushed aside for sacrificial non-use, it is forever rendered ineligible for sacrificial service. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan does hold that. So listen, now watch this. A very interesting halacha. So I've done Rabbi Yochanan. If you have an animal that belongs to two partners, Reuven and Shimon own an animal jointly. Now what happens? Hekdish chatzia, v'chazer v'lakach chatzia, v'ekdisha. So let's say Reuven was makdish, he consecrated his part of the animal. Then what did he do? He buys out Shimon, and he subsequently is makdish, consecrates the other part of the animal. So what's ta'alacha? Kiddusha ve'ena kreva. The animal is consecrated. In other words, essentially it has monetary sanctity, but cannot be offered up as a karban. Now, why can't it be offered up as a karban? Because at the time of the initial partial consecration, it could not be offered up as a karban. Why couldn't it be offered up as a karban? Because you can't offer as a karban a partially consecrated animal. So essentially, since at the initial stage of consecration, this animal cannot be offered up as a karban, it is forever set aside for sacrificial non-use. So even though Reuven subsequently buys out the ownership interest of Shimon and consecrates the newly acquired part as well, the animal has financial sanctity, but cannot be offered up as a karban. Ba'osa tmura. Interestingly enough, but the animal can be made into a tmura. In other words, if you exchange it for another animal, there's the tmura penalty that both animals are consecrated. Tmura sakiyotzeba, and its tmura has the same status. So we'll say from this case, shma mina tzlas. We learn three things. Number one, shma mina balei chaim nidchin. So we'll say this is very important. Balei chaim nidchin means that once an animal is set aside for sacrificial non-use, it never shakes that status. It is forever precluded from sacrificial non-use. Shmamina dichui me kara hava dichui. We see from here that again, once the animal is set aside initially from the beginning, that status can change. Ushmamina, and lesson number 3, yesh dichui bidamim. Ultimately, again, interestingly enough, an animal can be set aside even if it has financial sanctity. If you take a look at that top Rashi on 12b, yesh dichui b'damim, yesh toras dichui b'kedushas damim. Apapi sheni kedushas haguf kigon hacha she'dish chetzich. As I will say, even by financial sanctity, once an animal was set aside for non-use, ultimately, again, that status remains, because that's this case over here. When Reuben is makdish his half, remember again, all Reuben has is financial sanctity, does not have monetary sanctity. I'm sorry, has monetary sanctity, does not have physical sanctity. So you see that the concept of dichui, setting aside for non-use, applies even to financial sanctity. Incredible. I will say, I'll just point out something amazing over here. This phrase, if you notice, back on Amud Aleph for just a moment, the first lesson that the Gemara learned over here, Shmamina, Bale Chaim Nitchin, which means animals could be forever set aside for non-sacrificial use. Nitcha could be pushed aside. So we'll say tremendous Musar Haskell. It is only animals that could forever be precluded from becoming a carbon, coming close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Once an animal is set aside for non-use, for sacrificial non-use, it can never be redeemed. That is only a din by animals. But Baruch Hashem, not the halacha l'maisa, not the hashkafa l'maisa, by people. There is no such thing as a person. There's no such thing as a yid who is always nidcha, who is always set aside. There are times in life that I do things that ultimately compromise my spiritual standing. And there are times in life that I make poor decisions, I make wrong turns in life, and as a result, I am distanced and set aside from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that is only temporal and episodic. The power of tshuva, the power of change, is that no matter how bad the rut I get myself into, I could always find a way to extricate and pull myself out. This is a din shmamina balechayim nitchin. Animals could be set aside for permanent non-sacrificial use. Animals could be precluded from forever entering in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a din in animals, but is never a din halacha l'maisa or hashkafa l'maisa by people. No matter how bad the mistake, we can always extricate ourselves, redeem ourselves, and make ourselves into a carbon, come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incredible. Amar Ula, Rabbi Yochanan. We'll say some great cases over here. Achol chelev. Listen to this case. Achol chelev hifresh carbon. So watch this. Ruvain ate chelev, right? Obviously prohibited. That was saying, Hasi's calling out a case where he ate chelev b'shogeg, right? So he ate chelev b'shogeg, because remember, halacha l'maisa, if you eat shogeg, if you eat chelev b'mezid, that's kares. He ate chelev b'shogeg, accidentally consumed chelev, separate out of chadas, hifresh carbon. Then what happens? V'hemer das. He became an apikoris. Afterwards. Okay. Well, not okay, but you understand. In other words, he became an apikoris. V'chazer bo. And then he did shuvah. So I'll say, by the way, all of this could be happening in an hour, right? That's how fast change could occur. Right? See, he becomes an apikoris, and then Baruch Hashem, he does shuvah. So I'll say, so now what's the shaila? The shaila is, what's the status of his carbon? Now remember again, halacha l'maisa, you cannot offer up the carbon of an apikoris, right? Of an apostate. You can't offer up that carbon. So the shaila is now, so again, Reuben ate the chelev accidentally, separated out a carbon chatas, became an apikoris. As an apikoris, his carbon was precluded from being offered. But then Baruch Hashem, he did tshuva. So again, we're not asking about his status. He's about tshuva. The shaila is, what's the status of his carbon? So what's the halacha? Hoel v'nitche yitche, can't offer up the carbon. Why? Because since the carbon was set aside for sacrificial non-use at the time that he became an apikoris, once a carbon is set aside, it's always set aside. So therefore, again, the carbon cannot be redeemed. Now again, now what does that mean? Effectively, what does that mean? What does it mean? He's going to have to bring another carbon. In other words, he still has his obligation of bringing a chatos, but Lamaisi cannot use that particular animal. Incredible. Another case. Itmar Nami, Amr Rabbi Yomi, Amr Rabbi, very fun cases here. Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Achal chelev v'hifresh carbon, v'nishtata. Listen to this case. Ruvain ate chelev, right? He ate chelev, separated out a carbon chatas, v'nishtata. He became insane, right? In other words, he lost mental capacity. The chazav v'nishtafa. Then Baruch Hashem. Then ultimately again, he went ahead and he regained his mental capacity. I will say, by the way, it's interesting the commonality between these two cases. Like the Gemara Masechah Sota says, when does a person sin? Ein adam chote ela imke nichnas bo ruach shtus. A person only sins almost like in an episode of temporary insanity. Sin makes absolutely no sense. When you put it on paper and you write the pros and cons, what's always going to win? When you write the pros and cons, what's always going to win? Ooh, really? Right? Okay, let me educate you a little bit. Right? The cons are always going to win. Right? All right, then we will start with Judaism 101 and start with that family for a little bit. Right? The cons, we'll say, right? Let me go on record. The cons will always win. The cons will always win. Why? Because whatever you get from sin is always temporal and episodic. Whatever you're going to get has a very limited shelf life. Right? The pros. The cons could be eternal. So the Gemara says the only reason a person sins is nichnas bo ruach shtos. It's like temporary insanity. I'm losing my mind for a moment. I'm just losing control. I'm losing rational thought because it doesn't make any sense. Interesting that just the juxtaposition of these two cases. So in case number 2, Reuven eats chaylev. He goes in and separates out a carbon chatos. Then he slips into temporary insanity. Quite literally, in other words, he becomes a shota. He loses his mental capacity. And then what happens? We'll say, then he recovers, Baruch Hashem. What's the halacha? So we'll say now the shaila is, can you offer up the carbon? Now remember again, the carbon of a shota, the carbon of someone who's insane, a shota cannot offer up a carbon. Because remember, to offer up a carbon, you need das. You need intellect, mental capacity. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Hol v'nitche yitcha. Since the carbon was set aside for non-use, non-sacrificial use, ultimately, again, it remains precluded from use. So we'll say, so the point over here is these two cases are two illustrations of the halacha that the Gemara just said on Amud Aleph. Namely that what? Shmamina, Balei Chaim Nidchin. Once an animal is actively set aside for sacrificial non-use, it remains set aside for non-use. In other words, once you cannot offer it, by definition, you cannot shake that status of, or that state of non-offering, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the carbon becomes precluded from use, even if the owner's status changes back to what it originally was. Incredible. So, by the way, why do I need both of these cases? They're kind of both illustrating the same concepts. Why do I need two cases to illustrate the same idea? I need both. I'll tell you why. Because if it would have just said the first case of the apikores, mishum dehu dachi nafshe biadayim. And I both say, in that case, maybe I'd say, Reuven chose to become an apikores. So because he chose to become an apikores, ultimately, again, because of that, that's why the carbon can't be offered. You made a choice to go off the derech. You made a choice to become an apikores. Fine, so that's it. Very nice. He decided to do tshuva. That's fantastic. But at the end of the day, the carbon is set aside for non-use because of the decision you made. But in the case of where it becomes a shota, ultimately, he didn't choose to go insane. Rather, happens also, which, by the way, is so incredibly important because it's also Chazal giving us a window into mental illness. Right? Mental illness is often fundamentally misunderstood. Right? Sometimes people don't understand person suffering from depression. So people will say, suffering from depression, so just become happy. Go ahead and just come on. Why can't you just change your disposition, change your mindset? It's like telling a person who has cancer, why can't you just get better? Why can't you just get better? This is one of the things that's so complicated that people don't understand about mental illness, that it is no different. It is no, just because you can't see the physical symptoms, it is no different than any other illness that affects the individual. So the Gemara is saying over here, the Gemara is saying in the case where the guy becomes a shota, which essentially is mental illness, in that case, ultimately, again, that's happening de facto to him, right? He's not choosing that. That's occurring to him. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, since, again, the guy's becoming a shota, that's a situation that is occurring to him, kiyashen dami. It's no different than someone who falls asleep. And I must say, right, this is very interesting. When you're asleep, what's your status when you're asleep? What's your status? It's fascinating to a certain degree, kind of like a shota. Now, why is that? Because a person who's asleep doesn't have das. Now, it's true and not true. Because what's the halacha of when you're asleep? Ultimately, you roll onto a kli and you break it. What's the halacha back to our Baba Kama days? Right? You're chayiv. Right? Why? Adamu ad li'olam. So you see that halacha l'maisa, again, even when you're asleep, Still, there's a sense of responsibility, but lamaisa, at least I can say, we don't say that every single time a person goes to sleep, their carbon can't be offered up anymore, right? We don't say that. We don't say that. So I would have thought that maybe the case where he becomes a shota is kind of like the case where he falls asleep. Therefore, the Gemara has to say that that's not true. Furthermore, again, if we would have just said the case of nishtata becomes insane, loses mental capacity, he doesn't have the ability to come back. In other words, at will. But in the case, ultimately, again, where it becomes an apikores, ultimately, since he has the control to come back on the derech when he chooses, which I both say is so incredible. Even if you become an apikores, you control your ruchnias. You control your ruchnias. You want to be an Oved Hashem, you make that decision. I might have thought emolo. I might have thought, therefore, maybe the carbon is not precluded from being offered. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, I will say, ultimately, again, we require both of these cases. Again, so therefore, both cases, interesting illustrations, ultimately, of yesh dichui, or as the Gemara said, balei chayim nirchim. That once an animal is set aside for non-sacrificial use, ultimately, even if the status changes, halacha l'maaseh, the animal still remains prohibited. Let's go back to one more case. Rabbi Yirmiyah, interesting case here. Achal chaylev hifish carbon. Listen to this case. Ruvain ate chaylev, right? Accidentally. And he separated out a carbon chatas. Vahoru bezin shechaylev mutter. Now watch this. After he separated out his carbon, Sanhedrin paskin that you're allowed to eat chaylev. Back to our hurriest days, right? They can't eat chaylev. So I'll say, so now what happened? The chazru bahen, then Bezin retracted their ruling. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Mahu. Mi havadichui, o lo havadichui. Ultimately, again, so we'll say, what is the status over here? Right? So do we say that halacha l'maisa, since had he sinned after the Beis Din made their ruling, he would not be chayav a personal carbon, right? Because halacha l'maisa, he would have been covered under the par he'elam davra min atzibur, the communal offering. Therefore, his carbon is set aside for non-use, or not. Amaleu saba ki pasach Rabbi Yochanan b'dichuyin meha pasach. When Rabbi Yochanan would give the examples of dichoy, he would definitely use this case. My taima, hasam gavra etri carbon lo etri, hacha carbon nami etri. In fact, the Gemara says this is actually one of the greatest examples of dichoy. Why? Because we'll say in this case over here, in the previous cases, it wasn't the carbon itself that was compromised. Rather, what was compromised in the previous two cases was, think about this, what was compromised in the previous two cases? It was the individual who was compromised, right? Let's say Ruvain became an apikores, or Ruvain lost mental capacity. Ruvain was compromised, but the carbon was fine. This case is even a better illustration of dichui, because in this case, the carbon itself was actually compromised. And therefore, again, this is a great illustration, ultimately, again, of a carbon being set aside ultimately, again, for non-use. One more lanabus and then we'll stop. Shimon ben Azai said, I heard from 72. Now he didn't say 72 elders. He said 72 zaken means old men. Rashi says, why did it say 72 zaken singular? The Gemara says, because ultimately, again, all 72 were of the same opinion espoused in the Mishnah. What was that opinion? That opinion was that all karbanos that are offered up shalol l'shmo, ultimately, again, the carbon is kosher, but doesn't work for the owner, except for Pesach and Chatos. And this was a universally held opinion that was held by all 72 elders. To show that there was complete unanimity in opinion, it didn't say elders plural, rather it said elders singular. We'll stop over for today. Shkoyach. What a daf. What a daf. All right, Chavra on Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. Every
time I see Rabbi Yirmiyah, I feel like another thing. Right.